as we're honing in on the 10-year anniversary of Gamergate, I really wanted to come out and say the grifters blew it. Okay, Ethan Ralph, Shoe on Head, Medicare, Mundane Matt, like all of these people who spearheaded the movement, who were like gung ho on Gamergate, didn't know anything. They completely dropped the ball. They failed. They completely, really refuse to address any of the real problems when it comes to gaming, when it comes to gamer culture, when it comes to gaming media. And they made it about something that it really wasn't, about politics, about feminism, about, the people who are running the gaming sites and not the companies themselves, right? I have been very vocal about this for a long time. I've speaking out about this. It's a major reason why I started this in video games, trying to address the issues. And what it all comes down to really is everybody is only interested in making money, right? They're not interested in talking about fun games. They're not interested in talking about epic fails from major established franchises. Everybody just wants to circle jerk around, getting hyped for the next big thing, regardless of whether or not it's going to be any good, right? Over and over and over and over again. And that's true for both sides of the political aisle, right? Gamergate was not a political issue, fundamentally. The issue with Gamergate was that enough people began to notice that video game journalists were being completely unreliable. Their coverage of video games that generation really left a lot to be desired. They were openly advocating for bad video games. Stuff like The Last of Us, stuff like Killzone Shadowfall, stuff like The Order 1886. All of these major, major, major PlayStation and Xbox releases, these were the people that were openly defending Destiny, right? The absolute scum of the earth, right? And over the past decade, in spite of the major shill campaign for Bungie, trying to damage control the product, trying to tell us that oh, the game is good, guys, you're just not giving it a fair shot. You just had your expectations set way too high. Over a decade of that, and people are beginning to realize that oh yeah, Bungie's going bankrupt. They bungled their deal with Activision. They bungled being independent. They sold out to Sony, and now they are in the process of being shut down. Years and years of damage control for this company, and for what? Everybody just moved on to the next company. They moved on to CD Projekt Red, or tried to, right? They put out The Witcher 3, the game that somehow won Game of the Year 2 times in a row, right? Two-time Game of the Year award winner, get Witcher 3. It was supposed to be this hallmark of video game design. It was supposed to be the next big thing. It was supposed to lead CD Projekt Red into being the biggest name in video games. And what happened? They put out Cyberpunk 2077, a complete disaster that completely failed on every way, shape, and form, and it had nothing to do with the glitches, right? Everybody always says oh, if you play on a powerful enough gaming PC, the game is perfectly fine. But in reality, the game was completely broken at launch. It has nothing to do with the game itself, with the glitches and the bugs. The game is just not very fun to play, right? Nobody wants to acknowledge that, right? Over the past several years, we've just seen people bend over backwards, refusing to acknowledge all the very real problems with the Western video game space, while aggressively downplaying the superior Nintendo developers, right? Whereas every other Japanese developer, doubled down on becoming more and more Westernized, becoming terrible. Square Enix, Capcom, Sega, all these companies just making all their IPs, ruining them, with it had nothing to do with political issues, right? It had everything to do with companies not understanding what made their games fun, refusing to evolve, and just trying to chase that elusive Call of Duty audience, that elusive modern audience. And yeah, these gamers, quote unquote, the Gamergaters, they couldn't bring themselves to admit that their precious PlayStation, their precious Xbox, their precious gaming PCs, that they were all heavily entwined with this situation, right? The narrative has always been that, like, oh, Valve is base. They would never do anything wrong. Xbox is base. PlayStation is base. They just want to make money. It's only a handful of woke infiltrators that are ruining everything for anyone. Oh, the ethics board. Hey, genius. The ethics board wasn't responsible for the release of the original version of Final Fantasy 14, right? The ethics board wasn't responsible for Final Fantasy 7R. It wasn't responsible for Kingdom Hearts 3. It wasn't responsible for Final Fantasy 15 or like anything that Square Enix has done. Like the ethics board had nothing to do with the actual problems at Square Enix. And that is exactly my problem. Is that this like woke controversy, the complaining about feminists, like it was just a smokescreen to distract you from the real problems. The reality that there is no reason for platforms other than Nintendo to ever exist, right? It's always been a bad thing for the industry. They have been introducing toxic developers into the space. They've been introducing like bad business practices and throwing millions of dollars into things that don't sell, right? They've been getting worse and worse over the past several decades. Like, a decade ago, we had Gamergate, and 10 years later, considering we fixed absolutely nothing with the gaming space, they went ahead and put out Suicide Squad, right? Now, to a lot of people, this seems like, oh, it's an out of nowhere thing. Oh, I'm going to blame the new leadership at Rocksteady. I'm going to blame Warner Brothers. I'm going to blame like woke culture. But in reality, Arkham was never good. Like enough about the whole like, oh, Gotham Knights was the end of 3. No, like Arkham Knight was bad. Arkham City was bad. Arkham Asylum was just kind of okay, right? Like it wasn't a great game by any stretch of the imagination, but people pretended it was. People pretended like it was some masterpiece just because it had Batman in it, just because it was a shovelware product wrapped in like a license that they recognized. Like, oh man, Batman is coming to the PS3. Like we have to defend this game. Let's ignore the fact that there are so many better beat 'em up games out there. It's Batman. You get to be Batman. You get to hear Kevin Conroy's voice. Ooh, Mark Hamill is playing the Joker. I bet that final boss is going to be the greatest of all time. Like, people were legit talking like that. They had no regard for the fact that there were better games out there. They had no regard for like the competition. They had no regard for like just how dumb it all was to begin with. Real gamers were looking at Batman Arkham Asylum right from the get-go and telling you all that like that game looks like trash. Just complete nonsense, right? That game looks bad. Bad man, I suppose we could call it now. So, and you refuse to listen, right? You refuse to acknowledge that the combat was simplistic, the stealth wasn't all that great, that the boss fights were abominably bad, that the writing was subpar, somehow falling below a 20-year-old children's cartoon, right? Like that's how bad it was, right? But no, like Arkham was the greatest thing ever because the people who play Arkham don't play video games, right? And the issue has persisted. Like I'm seeing a lot of people coming out defending Suicide Squad the same way that they defended Arkham. Like oh, the only people complaining about this game are people like who are woke, who hate woke stuff. Like let's ignore the actual problems. Let's ignore the reality of the situation. Let's ignore all the problems that Suicide Squad has. Let's just try to pretend that the people who are acknowledging that your game isn't great are somehow toxic or out of touch, right? Let's pretend that these people don't know what they're talking about, right? That is Gamergate in its purest essence. Is like developers, these creators, the people behind these games justifying their bad creative decisions by attacking the fan base. Like, oh, you would like it if you actually gave it a shot. Like, even though you obviously wouldn't, even though we have standards, right? And that's not what people tried to pretend it was about. Everybody tried to pretend it was about politics. And that in and of itself, like, destroyed the entire thing, right? Now, it destroyed Gamergate, but it evolved into something else. Like the anti-woke movement, I would say today has a lot of roots in Gamergate, right? Gamergate didn't really die; it evolved into its next form, right? It evolved to the next level. People are like, talking back to their teachers. People are like learning about corrupt politicians. They're learning about like, the agenda. They're learning about like how this woke stuff like affects their everyday lives and how it's a way bigger deal than just video games. Gamergate was a major cultural milestone, but it absolutely was held back by idiots like Internet Aristocrat. It was held back by people like Monday and Matt, by Dame Pesos, by these people, Ethan Ralph. These people absolutely had it in them, I think, to kind of lead the charge against corruption in video game journalism, but they completely dropped the ball. They failed, and now you see like their modern equivalents. People like Worski, people like PPP. These fat fucking retards, right? They're just sitting there trying to like, Gamergate was cringe. Oh, I would never do anything like that. They say as they sit in their like 6 hour live streams making fun of people that like nobody has ever heard of or cares about. Yeah, you're not as bad as Gamergate. You're worse. You're worse than Gamergate. You are the everything wrong with the Gamergate community, right? The more I think about it, like I become more and more impressed with the people who managed to come out of Gamergate, being much more influential and people who are more neutral, but ended up doing a lot more good for the community, right? People like JonTron, people like Kite Tails, people like Razor Fist, right? All of those people like did a lot more to kind of like, talk about the real issues, talk about the corruption of video game journalism, talk about wider topics, talk about like whatever, while still retaining their love and interest for video games. And I do think that is the root of the problem. Even now, I don't believe that the major personalities behind Gamergate actually care about video games. Even now, I don't believe that. And that was a major issue regarding this controversy from the very beginning.